हेलो नमस्कार आदाब ख़वातीनो हज़रात, आप सबका इस्तकबाल फिर एक बार से मैं करता हूँ मेरे चैनल पे। हेलो एवरीवन, थैंक यू, I welcome you to my channel. Thank you for joining me again. We will continue with Sahir Ludhianvi because he is my all-time favorite poet. And this particular Nazm is from his collection called Kulliyat-e-Sahir. And before we delve into this Nazm, it's a pretty short one. Before we delve into this, we need to talk a bit about poetry, society, and the halat of the time, waqt halat, time and the time and state of things. Unfortunately, what the regular person knows about Urdu poetry is just, oh, it's just all about love, it's mehboob, ishq, this, that, blah, blah, blah. This is actually a microcosm of Urdu literature. In fact, Urdu was one of those languages that from the beginning, the poetry and the literature in Urdu directly spoke against social ills of the time. And it still does. Urdu poetry has always been the poetry of progressivism, the poetry of human rights. Now, whenever poets have tried to write, let's say, more unpalatable poems in Urdu, radical, religious radicalist poets in Urdu, poetry in Urdu, it has never really been accepted into the mainstream, and that is why you never actually see such poetry in Urdu poetry, which you will see in Hindi poetry, which you'll see in English poetry, but in Urdu poetry you do not see that. So Urdu poetry has always been the tool of revolution, has been the tool of inqilab, has been the tool of addressing social change. And Sahir Ludhianvi was among the foremost of those poets, along with poets like Kaifi Azmi, Ahmed Faraz, Faiz, I forget the other name of Akbar Abadi. Anyway, so all these poets were extremely strongly, Javed Akhtar, of course, were all, Mirza Ghalib, of course, was also a progressive poet. So, using this thread, we get to this poem, this Nazm of Sahir Ludhianvi, which is called Khoon, Phir Khoon hai. Blood is just blood. And it was said by Jawaharlal Nehru about this poem, एक मकतूल लोम्बा एक जिंदा लुमुम्बा से कहीं ज्यादा ताकतवर होता है. So Lumumba here refers to Patrice Lumumba. So let me give you a little bit of historical context. Among all the colonization projects all over the world, the native inhabitants of the land have always been oppressed brutally, have been stripped of their dignity, they've been stripped of their culture, their indigenous knowledge, they have been stripped of their very identities, they have been murdered, displaced over and over again. This has happened all over the world. But the worst of it that happened was in Belgian Congo. Comparatively speaking, India got away with a lot of its own culture and languages and everything preserved, and old systems of knowledge, culture. India actually really escaped this part of cultural genocide admirably. But the African nations, the Latin American nations did not. And Belgium was where it was so horrific. King Leopold II was the king of Belgium, who basically took Belgium as his personal fiefdom, right? Not the crown, but his own personal fiefdom. which means that he could do things in the Belgian Congo that were not allowed by Belgian law. Um, Things like, if the slaves did not pick enough rubber, did not collect enough rubber sap, the first day, the hands of his child would be chopped up and presented to him. If he repeated it the next day, the legs would be dismembered. There are brutal pictures that the Belgian gendarmerie themselves made and documented of a Belgian slave sitting with the decapitated skull of his infant in his hand and crying over it. Right? Belgian soldiers would cannibalize children of those tribes in Belgium, or in Belgian Congo, because they considered black people of the Congo to not even be human. They didn't even consider them to be our species, human, our brothers. So this is what happened in Belgian Congo. Now, they got independence. Belgian Congo, what we know today as the Democratic Republic of Congo, people of probably my age and my parents' generation would have been taught about this country in geography as Zaire. So this is all the same country. The Central African Republic also it was called. It was also called as the Central African Republic. Now, after independence, the Central African Republic elected a socialist party. They elected this man called Patrice Lumumba. Patrice Lumumba, like Thomas Sankara, was a hardened socialist, but he was not a vanguard socialist like Stalin was, for example. He was more of a democratic socialist. And so one of the first things that he did was he recognized that this land has been raped and pillaged for a century by these European powers. And this is a region which is extremely rich. It is one of the richest regions in the world in terms of natural resources. Lumber, minerals, what have you, right? And this is why today China is destabilizing the Democratic Republic of Congo. Poor Africans, they never get a break. So when Patrice Lumumba recognized this, he immediately recovered the mining operations and lumber operations from the hands of the colonials and nationalized them. Now, of course, who didn't like this? The Americans and the British and the French. Eisenhower was the president. Dwight Eisenhower was the president at that time, post-war America. He was the one who got involved in the Korean War in the US, in Korea. Who got the United States involved in the Korean War. Why? Because one half of Korea wanted to nationalize its resources, which means that the Western capitalists could not own those resources of the other country and set up companies and trade. This is the same thing that happened in Iran when Mossadegh was elected as the first democratically elected prime minister of Iran, who nationalized Iran's oil industry, and the CIA staged a coup, assassinated him, and installed the Shah. This is something that was to happen also in Congo, but something worse happened. Eisenhower is on record saying, "I wish that this troublesome man drowns in a lake full of crocodiles and dies." Adam Dulles, a CIA agent, was responsible for coordinating the overthrow of the democratically elected government of the Central African Republic under Patrice Lumumba. They installed a fascist dictatorship in the Central African Republic at that time, who were sympathetic to Western capitalistic interests, who would return ownership of the mines to these Western companies. And so that dictatorship then sent Patrice Lumumba into exile. And in 1961, Adam Dulles started an operation with help from with help from the British intelligence and the French intelligence, where they sought out Patrice Lumumba in exile and shot him and his two associates so that they could never make a comeback. And they were buried in unmarked graves. After that, a few days later, the Belgium gendarmerie dug up the bodies and dissolved the bodies in sulfuric acid, bones and everything, to leave no trace of the assassination. At that point, people knew that he was assassinated, but no one knew by whom, what, how. People, of course, suspected it would have been the CIA, because at the time they were doing this rampantly across the world, wherever socialist governments were democratically elected by the people rather than capitalists. And so, of course, Sahir Ludhianvi had to write about this. And that is why Nehru said, "Ek maqtul Lumumba, ek zinda Lumumba se zyada taaqatwar hai." It is his death that is more powerful than his life. And so this Nazm is called Khoon Phir Khoon hai. And let us dive into this. जुल्म फिर जुल्म है, बढ़ता है तो मिट जाता है, खून फिर खून है, टपकेगा तो जम जाएगा. So he already starts off with a revolutionary spirit. जुल्म फिर जुल्म है, बढ़ेगा तो मिटा देंगे उसको. खून फिर खून है, टपकता है तो बहता नहीं है, वो जम जाता है. खाके सहारा पे जमे या कफे कातिल पे जमे, फर्क इंसाफ पे या पसे सलासिल पे जमे. खाके सहारा, the dust of the Sahara desert. Kafe Katil, hands of the killer, of the murderer. Farq insaf, in the discrimination of justice. Pae salasil, in the chains of your feet, what you're chained to. These are all strongly socialist archetypes and motifs. खाक सहरा पे जमे या कफे कातिल पे जमे, फर्क इंसाफ पे या पाए सलासिल पे जमे, तेग बेदाद पे या लाशाए बिस्मिल पे जमे, खून फिर खून है, टपकेगा तो जम जाएगा. तेग बेदाद, the sword of someone with no conscience. या लाशाए बिस्मिल, the bodies of the slaughtered, the bodies of the mercilessly slaughtered. तेख बेदाद पे या लाशाए बिस्मिल पे जमे, खून फिर खून है, टपकेगा तो जम जाएगा. लाख बैठे कोई छुप छुप के कमीगाहों में, खून खुद देता है जल्लादों के मस्कन का सुराग. लाख बैठे कोई छुप छुप के कमीगाहों में. Kaminga, those secret layers where they all hide themselves, those war rooms which are not open to the public, where the chess players of power play their moves. लाख बैठे कोई छुप छुप के कमीगाहों में, खून खुद देता है जल्लादों के मस्कन का सुराग. जल्लाद, tyrant. Maskan, where they are. सुराग, clue. लाख बैठे कोई छुप छुप के कमीगाहों में. The blood itself tells you where they are. खून खुद देता है जल्लादों के मस्कन का सुराग. साजिशें लाख उड़ाती रही जुल्मत के नकाब, लेकर हर बूंद निकलती है हथेली पे चराग. साजिशें लाख उड़ाती रही जुल्मत के नकाब. और जुल्म is oppression. Naqab, a veil. Sazish, conspiracy. So what Sahir is saying, basically, it doesn't matter under what veil, how they veil all their oppression and what conspiracies they spread about what they do. लेकर हर बूंद निकलती है हथेली पे सुराग. Every blood, हथेली पे चराग, every blood drop on your hand burns into a lamp that casts a light on all this oppression. जुल्म की किस्मत नाकारा और रुसवा से कहो, जब्र की हिकमत परकार ईमान से कहो. किस्मत नाकारा और रुसवा, those people whose fate is helpless and has left them, doesn't matter. Tell them their fate has left them because of the oppression of others. जुल्म की किस्मत नाकारा और रुसवा से कहो, जब्र की हिकमत परकार की ईमान से कहो. जब्र, force, might. Hikmat parkar is a very sarcastic way of saying the wisdom that is born out of this force. Ki iman, a gesture, whatever this force, how this force manifests, tell it. महमिल मजलिस अक़वाम की लैला से कहो. महमिल मजलिस अक़वाम, मजलिस parliament, अक़वाम awam, people. Aqwam is the opposite. Majlis-e-Aqwam is the assembly of governments, the assembly of nations, the United Nations. Majlis-e-Aqwam is the United Nations. Ki layla se kaho. People who still believe that the United Nations can actually do something, tell them. खून दीवाना है, दामन पर लपक सकता है. शोला-ए तुंद है, खिरमान पर लपक सकता है. खून दीवाना है, दामन पर लपक सकता है. शोला-ए तुंद है. It's an aggressively burning fire. The blood is a burning fire. खिरमान पर लपक सकता है. It can burn all your fields away. जुल्म की किस्मत ए नाकारा और रुसवा से कहो. जब्र की हिकमत ए पराकर की ईमान से कहो. महमिल मजलिस अक़वाम की लैला से कहो. खून दीवाना है, खून दीवाना है, दामन पर लपक सकता है. शोलाए तुंद है, किरमान पे लपक सकता है. तुमने जिस खून को मक्तल में दबाना चाहा, आज वो कूचाओ बाजार में निकल आया है. Those traces of your slaughter, that blood that you spilled on the battlefield, on Maktal, slaughter, the field of slaughter. तुमने जिस खून को मक्तल में दबाना चाहा, you wanted to suppress it, you want to hide it in the very fields where you slaughtered innocents. आज वो खून, आज वो कूचाए बाजार में निकल आया है. Today it has emerged and has come into the town square and into the bazaars in front of everyone. कहीं शोला, कहीं नारा, कहीं पत्थर बनकर. खून चलता है तो रुकता नहीं संगीनों से. See, now this is a very important point. You know, whenever there is a revolutionary movement against oppression, it is always an asymmetric warfare, because the oppressed people don't really get to form drilled and professional armies. They don't have the resources, but the oppressor does. And this is what happened during colonialism, right? We as Indians should recognize this revolutionary spirit, because we are also a revolutionary country. We also threw off the yoke of colonialism. When we ran the civil disobedience movement, it was called disruption. When we ran the non-cooperation movement, it was called disruption. When this didn't work, and when people like Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, Ram Prasad Bismil, Sukhdev, and all of them, they bombed up the train that was carrying gold bars for the British to their summer capital, to Shimla. Udham Singh, who assassinated General Dwyer in London on revenge for the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. For non-Indians who are listening to this, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919 was one of the darkest times of British colonial rule in India. The Jallianwala Bagh is a Mughal era park in Amritsar, where people used to gather with families for prayer meetings, for peaceful protests. In 1919, when people had gathered in Jallianwala Bagh for a peaceful protest against the British government. General O'Dwyer ordered them to evacuate, gave them literally less than a few minutes. There were over tens of thousands of people in that Bagh. Mughal Baghs are huge. Within a few more minutes, General O'Dwyer ordered the closure of all the gates of the Bagh, and from the 360-degree angle, from all the soldiers positioned outside, he ordered them to open fire. No one was left alive in the end at Jallianwala Bagh. Not kids, not women, not men, not old people. Right? When these things happen, what other recourse does this oppressed spirit have rather than to rise up and scream? Use whatever they have, stones, slogans. No, but when they do that, that's terrorism. Can an oppressed people really be terrorists? Indians, would you ever call Bhagat Singh a terrorist? Would you ever call Tantia Tope a terrorist? Massacre of Saharanpur during the 1857 War of Independence, when women, children, and entire families of British military officers were massacred. Is that terrorism? Chandrasekhar Azad, is that terrorism? Is any of this terrorism, or is this freedom fight? Are they freedom fighters? Think about it, because currently there is a part in the world where this has been going on since 1948, and only one of them in this asymmetric warfare is called the terrorist, and the other of 75 years of oppression is not called a terrorist. Think about this, when there is this massive imbalance of power between the oppressor and the oppressed. And this is what he's referring to here. तुमने जिस खून को मक्तल में दबाना चाहा, आज वो कूचा वो बाजार में आ निकला है. कहीं शोला, कहीं नारा, कहीं पत्थर बनकर. खून चलता है तो रुकता नहीं संगीनों से. संगीन weapons. सर उठता है तो दबता नहीं आईनों से. Sir uthta hai, when your head rises, it is not lowered in front of mirrors. In front of what mirror? In front of the mirror of self-reflection. Because a lot of oppressed societies get into a trajectory of Stockholm Syndrome. What is Stockholm Syndrome? It is when a kidnapper kidnaps a victim, and over time the victim begins to think that the kidnapper has their best interests at heart, and they are the only ones who can make their life better, not their parents, not their loved ones. Now see, now draw a line from this Stockholm Syndrome to the colonizer versus the colonized. The British and the Indians, what we call the colonial hangover today, comes because of India's penchant for white skin, for fair skin, all those fairness creams that are in the market. Why? This is Stockholm Syndrome. And this is what he says. Sir uthta hai to dabta nahi aino se. Now when our head rises, we will not lower it into Stockholm Syndrome in a wrongful self-reflection in front of the mirror. तुमने जिस खून को मक्तल में दबाना चाहा, आज वो कूचा वो बाजार में निकल आया है. खून शोला, कहीं नारा, कहीं पत्थर बनकर. खून चलता है तो रुकता नहीं संगीनों से. सर उठता है तो दबता नहीं आईनों से. जुल्म की बात ही क्या, जुल्म की औकात ही क्या. जुल्म बस जुल्म है, आगाज से अंजाम तक. जुल्म की बात ही क्या. What is oppression? What is its stature? उसकी औकात ही क्या. जुल्म बस जुल्म है. Oppression is just oppression from beginning to end. It has no value. It has no valence. जुल्म की बात ही क्या, जुल्म की औकात ही क्या. जुल्म बस जुल्म है, आगाज से अंजाम तक. खून फिर खून है, 100 शक्ल बदल सकता है. it can be the oppressed, it can be the colonized, it can be people oppressed under the caste system. It does not have to be literal blood. हम जब बोलते हैं कि खून पसीना करके मैंने ये काम किया है, it is not, you're not putting your literal blood and sweat into it, right? It's a metaphor. Discrimination, oppression does not always have to be violent. जुल्म की बात ही क्या, जुल्म की औकात ही क्या, जुल्म बस जुल्म है, आगाज से अंजाम तक खून फिर खून है, 100 शक्ल बदल सकता है। ऐसी शक्लें कि मिटाओ तो मिटते नहीं, ऐसी शक्लें कि मिटाओ तो मिटाए न बने, ऐसे शोले जो बुझाओ तो बुझाए न बने, ऐसे नारे कि दबाओ तो दबाए न बने। Those visages that you try to erase their identity will return and never be erased. Those embers, those sparks of revolution, however much ever they may try to quench, will never be quenched. ऐसे नारे कि दबाओ तो दबाए ना बने, those slogans of freedom, how much ever you try to oppress, will never be oppressed. जुल्म फिर जुल्म है, बढ़ता है तो मिट जाता है, खून फिर खून है, टपकेगा तो जम जाएगा। You see, this is why it is very important to engage yourself with literature and poetry, prose or poetry, literature of any kind, because literature, music, art are a few ways available for the oppressed to express their state of mind, their necessities, and the oppression. And we as Indians should never forget this. As a revolutionary country, we should recognize the power of literature in addressing these issues. And I will leave you with one advice, if I may, for younger students who are watching. I may have done this before, but let me reiterate. In all my career as a scientist, I continuously hear STEM students of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, either ignore the humanities, either dismiss the humanities, or at worst, disregard and belittle humanities such as literature and history. History is the story of humanity, and literature is the expression of feelings that not every man can put into words, but some can, and they provide voices to the voiceless. Please do not disregard, especially those students in IITs, because this is the most of the belittling of humanities is done by students of those elite institutions like IITs. Please don't do that. Engage with humanities, engage with literature, open your mind. People say that to physically travel the world, you probably will never have the time or the resources. But to travel the universe or the mind, one book is enough. And I will leave you with this. Thank you very much. Shukriya. Namaskar. Khush Amdeed.